You know, I was riding over to the studio today with my producer, Aaron, and he was expressing to me how fearful people are about what's going on in the country now. And sometimes I speak with Aideen, who's been my executive producer for over 20 years, and she said, Armstrong, people are really in fear. And then, you know, I talk to some people and they seem so ecstatic, so at peace, as if God has answered their prayers. And so what we decided to do today on this Saturday, February 8th, as we all look forward to Super Bowl weekend, is take all the issues, all the policies, as many as we can, and put them in a moral perspective and talk about them from a matter of faith and a higher source. And so if we're going to talk about morality and faith and relate it to the policy, you know, I've got to have my favorite pastor, A.R. Bernard, who is a mentor and author and a teacher at the intersection of faith and culture center in New York City. And then, you know, there's a show, The Preacher and the Rabbi. I probably got it. It's The Reb and the Rabbi. You know, I've been on this show a few times. And Rabbi Joseph Potasnik also joins us, who's the executive vice president of the New York Board of Rabbis. So let me start, you know, pastor's the man. So I'm going to start with you, Rabbi. Put in a moral healing perspective for us, the crash, the collision, as the American Airlines flight was about to land in Washington, D.C., and was hit head-on by a Black Hawk helicopter. And then we had the child and his mother and his medical team that crashed over Philadelphia. And then we had the collision on the runway in New York City. And it just seems as though everybody's focus is on this air travel now, and there's this fear of flying. So just give us some hope, or just give us some a perspective.
Armstrong, firstly, let me say thank you for two reasons. Firstly, for allowing me to be on the program and allowing me to be on the program with Reverend A.R. Bernard. He's not only your favorite, he's also my favorite. And he and I have been privileged to know each other for more than 20 years. So to bring us together as family is something that I very much appreciate. One of the most difficult things that we have to do with clergy is walk into a setting following a tragedy. The other day, I heard of a 4-month-old child that had cancer, was taken away. You go into a funeral and people look at you wanting an answer. Why? How could God allow something as horrific as this to happen? And I think we have a responsibility to be honest. I don't think God wants a 4-month-old child. I don't think he wants a helicopter and a plane to collide. I don't think he wants to see the loss of life. But the reality is that we have free will. God gave us free will. And with free will comes responsibilities as well. So there is no adequate answer why. I remember a funeral of a friend of mine. The mother of my friend came to me before the service and said, Joe, I want to ask you one question. God gave my son such wisdom, such warmth. Why did he give him more years? I never had an answer for her. I never had an answer for so many others. However, we believe that heavens are higher than the earth. So we simply say, I don't understand, but I also have faith that there is a God that has a divine design for the world, and I put my faith in God, and I'll walk on that path with that faith, even when my faith is very difficult sometimes to reconcile with what is happening on earth.
You know, Pastor Bernard, we look at these cargo aircrafts scooping up illegal migrants. Some say they're legal, some say they have no issues with their papers being in the United States, but they're all being scooped up, being deported to the country of their origin. And then many Americans applauded, saying that many of them are criminals, they're sex offenders, they've overstayed their welcome. Americans are struggling. Americans need to become first. It certainly was a part of Donald Trump's campaign. It was a promise made and a promise kept. But can you put that in a moral perspective for us, Pastor?
Gosh, Armstrong, I have to take your question and couple it to what you asked Rabbi, and that is to put all of this in perspective. This is not the first time that we are experiencing deportation. I remember back in the 60s where, there were friends and family members, extended family members, who were concerned because they were not necessarily here legally. They didn't go through the process. And at that time, they were concerned about raids coming to their homes, their place of employment, etc. So this is not new, nor is air collision new. We are sensitive to the loss of life, the families of the victims, et cetera. But what is different, Armstrong, is how we're covering it, how the news is covering it, how our elected officials are responding to it and commenting on it. This is a different universe. What might traditionally be considered virtues, such as truth, humility, empathy, accountability, integrity, these things are now being subordinated, Armstrong, to the pursuit of an agenda, a political agenda, a particular ideology, power, and loyalty. So it's a different universe for us here that we're wrestling with. So look, the things that happen as part of the human experience are not different, but the way we're covering it and the way we're experiencing it has changed dramatically. And what we need to do is bring it back to what truth and morality is and has been understood as something transcendent, transcending our political agendas, et cetera. And I think that's where faith and the role of houses of worship and religious belief systems come into play and are so important at this time. There has been an inversion. It's an inverted morality that we're experiencing in this current universe.
So how should the deportation be covered, Pastor? What is the context that should be covered in to give us better understanding?
Yeah, look, we live in a tension between moral order and social change and the reality that these systems and structures that are in place to uphold the moral order are necessary, but they are manned by wounded individuals, broken individuals, individuals that are not perfect. None of us are. So we need to examine these systems and structures from time to time to understand whether they are equitable, whether they are sensitive to the plight of all individuals that they govern. And we need to pursue changes within our social systems and structures. And at the same time, we can't do them in such a way that we dismantle, defund, or disrupt the need for moral order. Our nation has a right, every nation has a right to protect its borders. That is a right. But also, we have a Statue of Liberty that sits in the harbor here in New York. And it speaks to the compassion that we've had as a nation to understand that we've been built on a collection of individuals from around the world coming together as part of the American experiment. It's not easy, but we live in that tension and we try to balance those two realities.
Rabbi, the president has made it clear that there are only two genders, male and female. No longer X. You're either born a man or a woman. Some people feel that that is something that maligns them, does not acknowledge who and what they are. And yet, if you go to an airport and you deal with security, they say it's difficult enough when you have two genders, but when you add another, it can be exploited by terrorists and people who can use the system to get into other countries to bring about terror and harm. Talk about this from a moral perspective.
So firstly, let me go back to something you mentioned during immigration, because it's personal for me. Before I got on the program with you, I received a text message from somebody I know who worked in a house of worship, went back to Peru, but worked in a house of worship for some 25 years and paid taxes to America during those years. And he said, if you could write a letter of recommendation for me, that would be helpful for me now in Peru. I look at that person as someone who contributed to society, and fearful of what would happen to him, he ran back to his country. I'm not sure that's the right thing. I always felt there has to be some for citizenship, as many have spoken of. So I just want to relate that personal thing. When one looks at the Bible, and this is true for Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, I think it's clear that, he and she were created by God, but he and she are different. There is now a call by those who identify differently, who are saying, I don't conform to your distinction, find a place for me. And that's a challenge. Contradicts.
Are you saying then that we need to update God and we need to update morality when you say that's a challenge?
Well, I think we have to look at it.
Look at updating God?
Well, we do update God. I look at, when we used to define death, used to hold a mirror to the nose, and then we recognize, no, that's not enough. Brain death. So we updated that.
So you're saying we need to rewrite the Bible then, to make it current for where we live today.
Rewrite it. I don't think we have to rewrite it. We used to say, given this new situation, how do we reconcile with what is in the Bible?
But the Bible tells us there's nothing new under the sun.
What's that?
The Bible tells us there's nothing new under the sun.
Well, I'm not quite sure what nothing new under the sun is. I think the Bible, we Jews, besides having the written law, have the oral law, which is the interpretation. And interpretation continues to grow. So
some people would call that progressiveness. You sound progressive. Is that what it is?
I call it tradition.
Tradition?
Because tradition is not stagnant. Tradition also grows over the years.
Let me be clear on something before I go to break. So you're saying we should consider that we should expand genders beyond man and woman. Is that what you're saying, Rabbi?
I think we have to look to find a place where people can be respected for who they are, even though it doesn't meet the strict criteria of our Bible. Look, we say...
No, hold that point. Okay. I got to take a break and come back. Don't go away. This is the Armstrong-Williams Show. So, Rabbi, is God's morality absolute and unchanging?
I think there are certain principles that are absolute. How we apply those principles to everyday living, that becomes a matter of discussion.
You didn't answer my question. I asked you a simple question. Is God's morality absolute and unchanging?
Well, give me the specific. I mean, when you say God's morality, give me a specific.
He created man and woman.
Right. And now we have someone who says, I don't identify with those two categories, right?
He gives us free will.
He gives us free will. But we also have a responsibility to respect the dignity of people. It's not easy. There's a text, a written law, we have an oral law, we look at it, we say, how do we bring this all together?
But his ultimate will for mankind never changes, his perfection. Are you saying that God can be perfected?
I'm saying that we can look at our contemporary period and see how do we take the truths found in our Bible apply them to today.
Let me switch. I'm gonna go to Pastor Bernard. Pastor Bernard, let me engage you on this topic.
Well, I think Rabbi is expressing the tension that we live in between a moral order that we subscribe to as a society at large, but we have questions as to authority. What is the ultimate authority when it comes to that moral order? Is it God? Is it divine? We have questions about identity, individuality, questions about reality. And Armstrong, we live in a world where we have a whole generation, the millennial mind that's embracing fluidity in gender, sexuality, and cultural identity. And they're reflecting a collective consciousness that we as clergymen, Rabbi and I, have to deal with. So I think Rabbi is struggling through not rejecting or canceling what these individuals are going through, and at the same time trying to hold fast to a moral standard. Differently, I subscribe to a biblical moral standard that has clearly indicated male and female as the identities that distinguish human beings. And for me, that's non-negotiable, that's unchangeable. I have a problem when we try to, because he talked about conformity, and usually it's the allegation against those who subscribe to a biblical narrative in terms of the world and how it should be ordered and lived in, that we're imposing that narrative. But at the same time, we have those who want to impose a different reality that is in conflict with how we understand and see reality. And that's the pluralistic society that we're in as America. So in many ways, we have to decide who or what is going to be the ultimate reality in our lives, and by what narrative are we going to judge what it means to be human, what it means to live in this world, what reality is. And that's the tension that we're in as a society. It's not a tension for me, I'm very clear, but it is a tension for those who are trying to reinvent that and redefine the norms that we've experienced, not just here in America as Christians and Jews, but historically throughout the world, in cultures. So this is not a necessarily new Christian idea. No, this has been true throughout history in cultures around the world, that fundamentally male and female identity have been foundational to the human experience.
Rabbi?
Look, I understand. It's, if you look at religious law, it's this and this. We try to balance two worlds. We try to balance, the biblical world with the contemporary world. And what I'm saying is, someone who identifies as transgendered, not meeting the trend, what do we do with that person? And I'm saying I have to find a place for that person to exist as well. Even though it contradicts what the text says, I still have a human being in front of me. Tell me what to do. Do I exclude that person? Do I say, you don't matter? If you don't change, you can't be included with us? We have a principle in Jewish tradition. If I hold a gun to your head and I say, eat that pork, you have to eat that pork because you have no choice. You're going to lose your life.
But I think
you're forced to do something.
I think you're being a little disingenuous in what you're saying here, because no one is saying not love someone, not protect them against violence, not show respect. I just asked you a simple question: who holds the moral authority, and who's the authority of perfection? I mean, I understand that none of us can live up to his standard of what God expects of us in his commandments, but are you saying, and I asked you a simple question, should we revise the Bible? Should we change God's commandments of us? That's a simple thing that I asked you. Are you going to accommodate? No. Are you going to accommodate these things that you discuss? Are you going to always ask them to strive for the standard, even though as human beings we fall short?
I never suggested that we change the basic commandments. What I suggested is we have to find a way, as you said before, to respect the person, to respect the dignity of the individual. So how we balance all of that is a challenge, so that people don't feel they're excluded if they don't meet certain standards. You stand on the outside. We're saying, the Catholic Church, for example, has over the years welcomed people who are gay to the church, even though it contradicts what the Catholic stance is. So it's a matter of how we find room for others, not changing the laws, but how do we find room for others who don't conform to the specific criteria? That's something we have to do.
Well, the question is, where do we apply boundaries? How far do we let this go? To what degree do we alter moral order to accommodate those individuals who disagree with it? We have a situation where we have adult males who say that they are naturally attracted to young boys. All right. We have been very careful in drawing lines, creating boundaries around that whole idea. Will we eventually accommodate that and say, well, that's natural to them? To what degree do we understand the natural order?
Well, we also have the protection of children. So, but I'm saying is, we can't look at this yes or no. Sometimes there's a cloudy area. And I think we have to do everything we can to see that people are respected, even though we disagree with their choice.
Let me go on to this next topic. I mean, there's so much in the news about the fact that this administration has placed a pause button on USAID. And no one argues with the abuse, how the money is misappropriated, but no one can also argue about the good that USAID provides for people around the world. How do you create a program that provides specifically for the people that is designated for, and it's not exploited, and people use it as their own little cash cow for their lifestyles? How do you balance that out? Do you just totally shut it down until you correct and try to minimize all the corruption, Pastor?
I think we have a problem here because there's a degree of hypocrisy. Thomas Sowell wrote a book called Conflict of Visions, and he described the two ideologies in conflict as a constrained vision of society, who are conservatives and Republicans, et cetera, and an unconstrained vision of society in conflict. And that he places progressives and liberals. And I think the language says that one says that there has to be boundaries and a specific order, and the other one says that there's no boundaries, no specific order, and we have to challenge that. One of the things that Sowell mentioned in the constrained view or the conservative view is that there's a problem when progressives want to make sweeping changes. And this was applied to the civil rights movement and the need to change what has held America captive, and that's the whole around the issue of race and the marginalization of people of color. So making sweeping changes is dangerous because there are unintended consequences that come from making sweeping changes. And yet here it is, this administration, which is conservative, which is supposedly Republican, which is supposedly the constrained vision, is making sweeping changes without thinking through the unintended consequences that come from that. So what happens is you ignite something, and then within a few days, when it creates outrage and disruption, you roll it back for another 60 days. Yeah, putting things on pause to a degree is important, but we have to be conscious how the impact that this level of disruption can have on the good while we're trying to weed out the evil. And I think that we need to think carefully how we're implementing these changes.
Rabbi, why does the Bible specifically tells us that the lawyers and doctors will have their day in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone?
Repeat the first part of it.
Why does the Bible emphasize that lawyers and doctors will have their day in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone?
First of all, I went to law school, so I don't know, what you're saying about me. Look, I'm not sure what the question is, but I want to go back to something.
Whoa. Before you go back to where you want to go back, Pastor, could you sort of explain this to your colleague?
Well, Rabbi Armstrong is speaking from the New Testament language.
Right.
When Jesus used the term lawyers, but he's not speaking of lawyers the way we understand the term in modern day language. He was speaking specifically of those experts in the law of Moses and doctors as well. And the whole idea of the lake of fire, again, Armstrong, that is a New Testament term that is Christian. So Rabbi would have a difficulty relating to those terms as you have expressed them in order to answer the question. How would you rephrase that question, Armstrong?
You know, obviously, big pharma, the medical community, the legal community are so involved with these institutions to further exploiting and harming people. And the Hippocratic Oath of Medicine is first do no harm. And I'm just asking about the morality of lawyers and doctors when it comes to putting their patient ahead of their own self-interest.
Well, I think there's a code, Hippocratic code. There are lawyers who deviate. There are lawyers who do bad things. There are doctors who do bad things, who don't prioritize as they should. But there are a lot of lawyers and doctors who do great things. Look at what's happened with cancer. Doctors who have struggled to find cures for cancer have been successful in some ways. Lawyers who fight for civil rights have been successful in some ways. So, we have to be very careful when we don't have nuance. We don't make distinction. When there's this all or nothing approach, you're either this way or that way, otherwise you're nothing. The USA, all of a sudden, a program that does help people, no, let's destroy the whole program without saying, wait a minute, maybe there are some people who do benefit. Let's not be so quick to destroy something until we've re-examined it, and maybe there are a lot of things there that we need to retain. So I'm very clear about this distinction. And by the way, morality to make distinctions. Morality tells us to look at all the circumstances, not just to say yes or no. There's a maybe.
That's a good point. And we'll be back. Don't go away.
It is easier to build up strong children than to try and repair broken men.
The streets are plagued with crime, violence. There's a lot of poverty, and it's all a result of lack of education that's happening in our schools. So it really is a crisis.
We come from very different political perspectives, but we've come to the same conclusion, and that is there is a crisis in the classroom. Children are being deprived of quality of life because they're being deprived of a good education. We must solve this problem. It's incumbent upon all of us to join hands together to get this done.
We can't afford to wait one more day before we address these issues, because every day we lose another child.
Let's stop the politicking. Let's stop the games. Let's really do something to give these kids a real chance at life and being a part of that American dream.
We need accountability for funding. Many of the districts where you're seeing very low test scores, students graduating with very low literacy and math comprehension rates, they are receiving a lot of funding. So where is the money going where our kids aren't being adequately educated?
If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. And we welcome back Pastor Bernard and Rabbi Potasnik. Rabbi, is the United States and Israel the invincible guarantors of Western civilization for the living and those yet to be born?
Well, I don't think anybody's invincible. I do think we have a responsibility. And the responsibility is to be that beacon of light, that beacon of hope to all people. We have a moral responsibility to be exemplars of decency and dignity. So I really, I believe that the alliance between Israel and America is one that is extremely important, and throughout the years has demonstrated that in our society, you are going to be respected as a child of God. You are going to be given dignity and decency, and we're going to find room for others who are different than we are. So that's why we're so committed to the eradication of terrorism, because terrorism doesn't respect human life. Terrorism doesn't respect difference, and that alliance allows us to stand. So I think, thankfully, over the years, we have found that Israel and America stand together as one.
And do you think that there will ever be any kind of peace and stability for Palestinians and Israel to live together?
Well, if you would ask me years ago, would I think there'd ever be a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, Jordan and Israel, Abraham Accords? I would say probably not. Do I think that Japan and America would have a relationship that is very, very positive? Probably not, looking back. But I think that's the problem with prediction. It's very dangerous and very often inaccurate. But we also have that hope. And we know that we have certain principles in place that can get us to a position where we find room for others who differ from us. We will not have peace in the Middle East until there's a solution for Palestinians. Otherwise, we're going to have a continuation of hostility. So I think what the president is saying is, look, this is not working. Gaza is not working. The hostility in the West Bank is not working. What happened on October 7th was a disgrace. Now what do we do about it? And I think that's the good thing about being a moral force, because you ask yourself, I know something is wrong. Now what do I do about it? I don't just deplore it. I have to make a decision what to do about it.
I think, Armstrong, we can make certain predictions, and those predictions can be made when it comes to human nature. And the reality is that you can't make peace with someone who doesn't believe you have a right to exist. And this is fundamental to the Jewish or Israeli relationship with many individuals within the Middle East who subscribe to a particular Arab world view. So we want to return from war to diplomacy, to talks, to trade-offs. There'll always be a trade-off. But will we experience peace, the absence of conflict? No, I think that conflict and tensions will continue because of that fundamental difference. If I don't believe you have a right to exist on this planet, the right to exist as a state or exist, period, it's going to be difficult for us to find common ground that leads to total peace. I think there'll be trade-offs. There will be times there where we have to have diplomacy in place. That's very real. And you can't come along and say that in 24 hours, you're going to come up with a solution that we've been struggling with for centuries, even millennia, between individuals within this region. It's not going to happen that way, Armstrong. I don't want to sound, pessimistic, but again, human nature is predictable. And we're talking about morals. We're talking about morality that emanates from an internal compass. But that internal compass depends upon how that conscience has been shaped and fashioned and informed. And there are two ideologies influencing the conscience and the internal compass of those in the Middle East.
I think, Pastor, what you're saying is, if you don't recognize the other right to exist, you're not going to have peace. And the very simple solution is, if it's simple for us to say, but it just needs to be simple for others to do, is to say, look, we fought long enough. We now need to find room for one another. The minute something like that happens, as with Egypt, all of a sudden you will see a transformation. People understand we're not going to be successful by continuing the struggle. We're going to be successful by continuing the struggle for peace. And I would hope that we'll see that in our lifetime.
Yeah, and it's a pursuit of justice, Armstrong, that we're really talking about here, a just solution to both sides within this conflict. Dr. Martin Luther King said that peace is not the absence of conflict, it's the pursuit of justice. It's the presence of justice. And that's what we're working towards.
Rabbi, On this past week, approximately 2 million federal workers had to literally make a moral decision whether or not to accept the buyout from this administration. I mean, when you think about, you cannot even possibly think what holes will be left unfilled. You cannot even possibly imagine what that means when you lose something so essential that may have been working there 30 and 40 years. We have no idea what the consequences of that may mean. But in terms of people making that decision and the government making that offer, talk about that from not only a moral perspective, but a very human perspective.
Well, the word dignity has been recurrent today. The word decency has been recurrent in our discussion. We live in this age where some people want instant answers. You know, it's like instant coffee. I want the coffee right now. I don't want you to take time to brew it. Just put in something in that glass with some water and give it to me. Instant answers very often don't have good results, don't have a good taste to it. We have people who have worked, who have given back, and I think we have to be more deliberate. By the way, we say that in Jewish tradition, be deliberate in judgment. Don't do it hastily, because when you do something hastily, you know consequence of that. It may be detrimental to the person involved. So I think the government, I understand the thinking here that we want to get rid of waste. We want to eradicate programs that don't work, but you can't do it overnight. We didn't get to this place overnight. We can't fix it overnight. So I'm very dismayed. I wouldn't want to be one of those federal workers who was given that option, that ultimatum. That's not fair. And I think that's where we as moral faith leaders, we have to stand up and say, you know what? The worker has to be respected. What you're doing is contrary to what we believe our tradition tells us. And I think Christians and Jews could stand together on it, as well as other faith groups.
Now, Pastor,
if I may respond to that, Armstrong, change is not an event. Change is a process. And we have to be careful how we manage the process of change. You know, it's like trying to turn an ocean liner around. That's a big vessel. The decision takes place in a moment, but the turning around of that big vessel takes about 5 miles. And if you do it too fast, it'll capsize. And what is true for an ocean liner is true for a government, especially a government the size of the American government. You try to turn that thing around too fast, it's going to top over. And we're going to have problems that we cannot imagine. So I think we have to agree that there needs to be change. Systems need to be changed. But the process that we engage in to create those changes must be wise, must be careful.
Yeah, and we're talking about human beings. We're talking about human families. We're not just talking about objects. And when you're looking at someone as an equal, when you're looking at someone as related to you, because we all have the same spiritual birth certificate, then that comes with respect for the other. And respect means don't do something that immediately makes it impossible for me to have the life that I'm having. Do it with some discussion. Do it with some deliberation. Don't rush to it, because that rush is going to hurt me and ultimately hurt you.
Pastor, you know, so many people have talked about what nature has been rendering to us with the fires in California, the hurricanes and the South, with the natural disasters overseas. Some people think that the world is in chaos and nature is also in chaos, trying to deliver a more direct message to mankind. Is there anything that we should take from the volatility of nature? Or does it go back to what you said at the beginning of the show? We've always had the deportations. We've always had these situations. And you can say we've always had this volatility in nature. We've always had volcanoes, Vesuvius, and we've had the earthquakes, we've had the tornadoes. And so there's nothing new under the sun. Is there something new here, Pastor Bernard?
I think what's new, Armstrong, is captured by the words of Jesus when he talked about signs of the times. These are prophetic indicators that emanate from the character of the culture and the frequency with which things are happening when it comes to nature, and we should pay attention to them. So I think we're experiencing things that have always taken place, whether it's the eruption of a volcano, whether it's fires like wildfires, whether it's hurricanes, etc. But I think what we need to pay attention to is the frequency with which these things are occurring. They're happening a lot more often. They're happening with greater frequency. And I think that those are indicators that we are in an interesting period within the human experience here on this planet, that maybe our attention is being called to a higher level of moral thinking, and a restoration of a moral anchor, which is foundational to the success of any society. So I would definitely read it that way. Others may disagree. I like the words of Charles Dickens in what he wrote when he did that incredible novel, A Tale of Two Cities. He said it was the best of times and the worst of times. Well, Armstrong, it's always the best of times and the worst of times. The question is, what are we going to do with the time that we have,
And
regardless of the conditions
we
given to
will
us?
be back. Don't go away.
As a home buyer, you need a lender who cares about your home ownership dreams. United Security Financial has been helping families secure their dream homes for 30 years. We're a national fair practice lender that provides affordable mortgages and low down payment programs to eligible home buyers. To learn how United Security Financial can help you secure your dream home, call 1-800-373-4186.
The pastor and the rabbi. We come to our final segment. You know, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some will tell us that it's based on a moral principle that all people should have equal opportunities to succeed. They will tell you that DEI, pastor and rabbi, is a moral imperative that can help create a more just and fair society, but yet is being dismantled everywhere, from contracting to offices within the federal government, colleges, universities, libraries. Your thoughts, Pastor, as you place this in a moral context?
Well, we won't understand today if we don't understand yesterday. The present is rooted in the past. So the question is, why do we have DEI in the first place? Why did we have affirmative action? Because there were some problems within our society in terms of how American citizens experienced American society. There were those who were marginalized based upon race. There were those who were intentionally disenfranchised based on race. So we need to understand, why do we have these things? Have they been misapplied? Have they been taken beyond what was originally intended? And I would say, absolutely. If we don't monitor these things, human nature kicks in and people will take advantage of systems. So I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think we need to go back and say, well, why do we have these things in our society in the first place? And let's right the wrongs with them instead of just canceling everything the way we are canceling everything.
But Rabbi, does it hold equity or equality of every individual? Some people say it should be about equality, not equity. Some people say meritocracy should matter, that you don't just place someone in a position because you look in a room and because you don't have to see the right shape or form, you feel it lacks diversity and you just plug it in with no consideration whether it's going to make that environment better or not. You just want it to look a certain way. How in our own morality do we balance that?
Well, I think conceptually, it is certainly noble to have as many people as possible be included. We don't want people left out. For too long, too many were excluded, didn't have the opportunity to participate. But just reacting to what Pastor said, I do think there has to be in that equation merit, competence. We want people who adhere to a certain standard. You don't want a doctor performing surgery on you who didn't pass certain. You don't want that professional saying to you, look, I didn't care about the test. I wasn't asked to pass tests. I'm just here because I looked a certain way. I sounded a certain way. So I don't think any of us would disagree. Let's get as many people into that pool, into that circle, but let's make sure that once in the circle, there's also a standard that's going to apply. So we're producing the best we can from that group.
You know, Pastor, tomorrow is the Super Bowl, and God's willing, I will be there. But it's also the biggest gambling day probably of the year. And it is amazing to me how much we push gambling in this country, where people lose everything they get. They go and bet on these lotteries. They say it's $1 billion jackpot. And it's normally the poor people who spending their money paying for these jackpots. Talk about the morality of gambling and that exploitation.
Look, Armstrong, when you wake up in the morning and prepare to start your day, it's a gamble, I think what we're talking about is habits. When people have an addiction, it becomes problematic. It becomes a crisis. The majority of people who attend a casino, they're there recreationally. Unfortunately, casinos make most of their money off of those who have an addiction. So I think that there's one thing to do it as recreation and exercising self-control. There's another thing when it becomes an addiction. So we have to be smart enough and have a moral compass to judge right and wrong, to judge extremes that protect us from many of the addictive behavior that can be destructive to us, and also from all of the commercials that are trying to give us an addiction, pull us into an addiction. And that's where we have to have an anchor for the soul. That's a moral compass to protect us from our vulnerabilities as human beings.
Rabbi, I want to go back when you earlier discussed the colleague, because of the deportation madness, fled to his native land. I just didn't get the message you were trying to convey in telling that story. What was the moral of that story?
Well, I'm trying to say there is a difference to me between someone who is a criminal and someone who over the years has participated in our society and has paid back. Do we treat those two the same? I think most of us will agree. Criminals must be removed because they pose a danger to us. But there are those who initially came here, overstayed the visa. What do we do with those who have, paid the taxes, done which is right, even though initially they did what was wrong? Do we just say, you came here illegally, you're going back, I don't care what you did over the years? Or do we make distinctions? Again, it's nuance. It's trying to see where there are differences and not putting everybody in that same category. We are different from one another. We have to recognize distinction. And I think our tradition tells us to be compassionate when necessary, to be fair, and therefore it's that weighing all the time. We talked about someone who's different, who doesn't fit, the criteria of the Bible. But that person could be a member of your family, my family. Do we discard that person?
You're describing all of us. You're describing all of us.
Yeah. So we have to look at, what does our tradition say? By the way, when you walk into a synagogue, the inscription over the ark is, know before whom you stand. And I think all of us, if we have that kind of commitment, know before whom we stand, we will make decisions, but they're not always easy decisions. They're not always yes and no. Maybe is an answer.
Pastor, I'm sure.
No,
No, Pastor, no. I must ask you because
I can't let DEI go
no.
by so easy.
No. We were about to run out of time. After you answer this, then you can come back to it. I'm going to ask you the most challenging question of the hour. Put in perspective, if you look at the Bible and all the people that you read about in the Bible and throughout your history, put in perspective our President of the United States, Donald Trump.
All right. The Bible is, in my tradition, a revelation of the sovereignty of God, God's purpose and meaning for humanity, for human history, which is ultimately human flourishing. That there is a fallen condition that we're in, and the whole story of the biblical narrative is the redemption of that fallen condition, that fallen humanity. Which means that if we accept that God is sovereign, that he's in control of human history, that he shapes it, that he puts those in power and removes those in power, then I have to say that our current president is there for a reason. The question is, what is that reason? And I find consistently that individuals are put in power in response to the condition of the society. This is what the prophets pointed to. So evidently, there's some things that needed to be exposed within American society that a Donald Trump can be used as an instrument to expose those things. And it's less about Donald Trump, and it's more about where we are as American society. We have been in an identity crisis for some time. Who are we? What are we when it comes to our relationship with each other, our relationship with the rest of the world? These are pressing questions. And I think that President Trump has been a catalyst for us to wrestle through these questions.
Wow. I want to thank the Rabbi and Pastor Bernard for your strength. It is not easy because people think you have all the answers, but you're a human as well. You just probably have a few more answers than what we have. I appreciate you guys coming on today, talking about morality, putting all these issues in perspective on this edition of the Armstrong-Williams Show. Enjoy this Super Bowl tomorrow, and I hope you take heed to their words and their example. I'm Armstrong-Williams, and thank you so much for joining us for this edition.